Bardstown, Kentucky, population 14,000. Voted the most beautiful small town in America, the bourbon capital of the world. Between 2013 and 2016, 5 people were murdered or vanished from this town. A police officer ambushed on a highway. A mother and daughter slaughtered in their home. A young mother who disappeared and was never found, and a father shot dead while hunting on his own land. 4 cases, 1 small town, and a road that connects at least 2 of them. Bardstown sits in Nelson County, about an hour south of Louisville, in the rolling green heart of central Kentucky. It is a town of old stone walls, bourbon distilleries older than the Civil War, and the kind of main street that tourism boards put on postcards. The county fair is a big deal. High school football is a big deal. Everyone knows everyone. And for most of its history, that was the whole story. A beautiful, quiet place where nothing much happened. But beauty and quietness are not the same thing as safety. Small towns keep secrets differently than cities do. In a city, a secret can vanish into the noise, into the million other conversations happening on the same block. In a town of 14,000 people, a secret has to be actively maintained. It requires cooperation. It requires people who know things deciding, together, not to say them. And when that kind of silence takes hold, when a town collectively agrees not to look too closely at something, it can last for years. It can outlast investigations. It can outlast grief. It can outlast the people who are supposed to be protected by it. Bardstown, for all its charm, would prove to be exactly that kind of place. A place where people knew things. And a place where, for a very long time, nobody talked. The economy of Bardstown runs on bourbon and tourism. The town is home to several major distilleries and hosts hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. But underneath the tourism economy, like in much of rural Kentucky, there was another economy. One that operated in trailer parks and storage sheds and along the back roads that wind through Nelson County. Kentucky has been hit hard by the drug epidemic, and Bardstown was no exception. Opioids, methamphetamine, and the networks that distribute them had woven into the fabric of the community long before the murders began. Whether the drug trade is directly connected to what happened between 2013 and 2016 has never been established, but it hangs over the cases like a second sky, always present, never fully explained. Then 2013 arrived. On the night of May 25, 2013, a 33-year-old Bardstown police officer named Jason Ellis finished his shift. Ellis was a 7-year veteran of the department and a member of the K-9 unit. He was well-liked, competent, and by all accounts a good cop in a town that didn't produce a lot of serious crime. He signed off on the radio, got into his cruiser, and headed home. His route took him along the Bluegrass Parkway, a divided highway that runs through central Kentucky. Ellis took exit 34, a ramp he had used hundreds of times, but that night, something was different. A pile of freshly cut tree limbs had been placed across the exit ramp, blocking the road. Not fallen branches, not debris from a storm. Freshly cut limbs, stacked deliberately in a position that forced any driver to stop and get out. Ellis stopped. He got out of his cruiser. His service weapon was holstered. He had not called anything in on the radio. He walked toward the branches. And then someone opened fire. Ellis was shot multiple times with a 12-gauge shotgun. He never drew his weapon. He never had a chance. He died on the ramp beside his cruiser a few miles from home. The first Bardstown police officer killed in the line of duty in the department's 150-year history. The scene was methodical. Whoever had placed those branches knew that a vehicle, possibly Ellis's cruiser specifically, would be coming down that ramp. The branches were not random debris. They had been freshly cut, which meant someone had prepared them recently, carried them to the exit, and arranged them in a way that forced a driver to stop and investigate on foot. That is not opportunistic violence. That is a setup. That is someone studying a pattern, knowing what time Ellis got off shift, knowing which route he took home, knowing which exit he used, and engineering a kill zone in advance. The shotgun was loaded and waiting. The shooter, or shooters, because investigators later received information suggesting multiple people were involved, fired from a concealed position. Ellis had no warning. No radio call, no chance to draw his weapon. He walked into an ambush as precisely constructed as a military operation. An anonymous inmate would later tell investigators that Ellis was killed because he was getting too close to an investigation involving storage shed burglaries and a drug ring. According to this inmate, at least 4 men had been hired by an unidentified person to carry out the murder. This was never confirmed. It was never disproven. It simply sat in the case file, one more piece of unverified intelligence in a case that would generate mountains of it. The person who called 911 was a driver who had come upon the scene. She and another motorist had found the blocked ramp, waited, then approached the cruiser when no one moved. They found Ellis on the ground. Police immediately classified the killing as a premeditated ambush. The branches had been placed there for a reason: to force someone, possibly Ellis specifically, to stop and exit their vehicle. The shotgun suggested planning. The location suggested familiarity with Ellis's route. But despite hundreds of interviews, forensic analysis of the scene, and an FBI investigation, no arrest was ever made. Weeks after the murder, the Bardstown Police Department received threats. One was a phone call. The other was a letter addressed to the police chief. Both carried the same message: what happened to Officer Ellis will happen again. Nobody was charged for the threats, and for a while, people in Bardstown told themselves it was an isolated tragedy, horrific but singular. A targeted killing of a police officer by someone with a specific grievance, perhaps related to a drug investigation or a personal grudge. Then, less than a year later, the second case proved that theory wrong. On April 21, 2014, a 48-year-old woman named Kathy Netherland failed to show up for work at Bardstown Elementary School, where she taught special education. Kathy's father went to her home to check on her. What he found inside was savage. Kathy had been shot several times. Her 16-year-old daughter, Samantha, had been bludgeoned, struck repeatedly in the head. Both of their throats had been slashed. Samantha had been preparing for prom. Kathy had been teaching the children of Bardstown for years, including, notably, the son of Jason Ellis, a boy with Down syndrome whom Kathy had worked with at the elementary school. And Kathy's workplace was the same school where Jason Ellis's wife, Amy, worked as a substitute teacher. That connection between the dead officer's family and the murdered teacher sent a current through Bardstown. Was it coincidence? Was it something more? Kentucky State Police released almost no information about the Netherland case. The only public clue was a blurry gas station surveillance photograph showing a black Chevrolet Impala in the area around the time of the murders. Police asked anyone who recognized the vehicle to come forward. No one did. No suspect was ever named. No motive was ever established. The case remains unsolved. The Netherland murders had a quality that made them different from the Ellis killing. Ellis was a cop. His death, while devastating, existed in a category that people could process. Officers are sometimes targeted. It is horrific, but it has a framework. The Netherland murders had no framework. Kathy was a teacher. Samantha was a teenager. They were in their home. The level of violence, multiple gunshots, bludgeoning, slashed throats, suggested rage, or a message, or both. This was not a burglary interrupted. Nothing was reported stolen. This was someone who went to that house to kill, and who did so with a brutality that spoke of intent far beyond simply silencing a witness. The people of Bardstown tried to process this. They held vigils. They put up signs. They told reporters about the caliber of people the Netherlands were, the kindness, the dedication, the normalcy of a teacher and her daughter in a small Kentucky town. But underneath the grief was a new feeling, one that had not existed in Bardstown before. Fear. 2 cases in less than 12 months. An officer gunned down on a highway ramp. A mother and daughter butchered in their home. And in both cases, the perpetrators were still out there, somewhere in the same small town where everybody supposedly knew everybody. The math was terrifying. 14,000 people, 2 unsolved murder cases, and the growing suspicion that the killers were not strangers passing through. They were locals. 2 cases in less than a year. A police officer ambushed with a shotgun. A teacher and her teenage daughter butchered in their home. Both in the same small town. Both connected, however thinly, by a school and a family. And both completely unsolved. Then came the third case. And the third case is the one that would eventually, after a decade of silence, produce answers, though not before it produced another body. On July 3, 2015, a 35-year-old mother of 5 named Crystal Rogers was last seen at the home she shared with her boyfriend, Brooks Houck, in Bardstown. According to Houck, Crystal had been sitting on the couch that night, playing games on her phone, when he went to bed. When he woke up the next morning, she was gone. Her car was not in the driveway. Crystal's mother, Sherry Ballard, began trying to reach her daughter. Calls went unanswered. Texts went unread. On July 5th, Sherry reported Crystal missing. That same day, Crystal's 2007 Chevrolet Impala was found parked along the Bluegrass Parkway, the same highway where Jason Ellis had been killed 2 years earlier, near mile marker 14. The car had a flat tire. The keys were still in the ignition. Crystal's purse and cell phone were inside. Think about that detail. The Bluegrass Parkway. The road where Officer Ellis was ambushed at exit 34. The road where Crystal Rogers' car was found abandoned at mile marker 14. 2 cases, 1 road, 1 town. Crystal Rogers was 35 years old, a mother of 5, and by the accounts of people who knew her, a woman who was trying to change her life. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had told friends and family that she was planning to leave Brooks Houck. She was going to start a new job. She was going to move out. She was going to take her children and begin again. Her mother, Sherry Ballard, confirmed this in interviews. Crystal had told her directly she was leaving him. Whether Brooks Houck knew about these plans is unclear. When detectives later asked him whether Crystal had discussed leaving, he said, "That's news to me. I don't know anything about that." But people close to Crystal, friends, family members, her sister, told a different story. They said Crystal had been making concrete plans. She had discussed logistics. She had discussed timing. And she had, apparently, discussed things she had learned. Things about people, about events in Bardstown, that made the people around her nervous. Crystal's mother would later tell reporters that she believed Crystal had overheard something related to the murder of Officer Jason Ellis. She never specified what. She never named names. But she was adamant. Crystal had learned something she was not supposed to know, and that knowledge, combined with her intention to leave Brooks Houck, is what got her killed. Crystal's family suspected Brooks Houck from the beginning. Crystal's sister told reporters that Houck had not offered once to search or help or do anything for the family. On July 8th, detectives brought Houck in for questioning at the Nelson County Sheriff's Office. And during that interview, something happened that would define the case for years. Brooks Houck received a phone call. It came from his brother, Nick Houck. Nick was a police officer with the Bardstown Police Department, the same department that had lost Jason Ellis 2 years earlier. And according to investigators, Nick called his brother mid-interview to warn him. The message, as investigators understood it, was simple: stop talking. They are trying to trip you up. Protect yourself. The call was a turning point. Nick Houck was summoned before a grand jury. He stopped cooperating with the sheriff's office. He eventually agreed to take a polygraph test, but only after the FBI contacted him. The examiner reported grave concerns about the results. On October 16, 2015, Nick Houck was fired from the Bardstown Police Department, and Brooks Houck was officially named a suspect in Crystal Rogers' disappearance. But naming a suspect and proving a case are different things. Crystal's body had not been found. There was no crime scene. There was no murder weapon. There was no confession. And there was one more complication: a white Buick. A private investigator working for the Ballard family discovered that a white Buick had been parked at the Houck family farm on the night Crystal disappeared. The car belonged to Brooks and Nick's grandmother, Anna Whitesides, 82 years old. Several weeks after Crystal vanished, Whitesides sold the Buick. Authorities issued a subpoena, suspecting the car had been used to transport a body, cleaned, and sold to destroy evidence. Whitesides refused to testify before the grand jury. A judge sealed all further proceedings involving her. The investigation into Crystal's disappearance was, from the beginning, complicated by an unusual problem. The local police department was compromised. Nick Houck, Brooks's brother, the man who had called mid-interview to warn Brooks to stop talking, was an officer within the Bardstown Police Department. That meant the very department that should have been leading the investigation had a member who was actively interfering with it. When Nick was fired in October 2015, the damage had already been done. The early hours and days of a missing persons case are the most critical, and during those hours, the suspect's brother had been inside the investigating agency, with access to information, evidence, and strategy. The case was eventually taken over by Kentucky State Police, and later, the FBI. But the taint remained. People in Bardstown whispered about what else Nick might have done, what information he might have passed along, what evidence might have been contaminated or lost during those first critical days. The Ballard family was vocal about their frustration. They felt the system had failed Crystal, not just because her boyfriend was the prime suspect, but because his brother had been wearing a badge the entire time. This is part of what makes the Bardstown murders so unsettling. It is not just that people were killed, it is that the institutions that were supposed to solve the killings appeared at times to be entangled with the people responsible for them. A police officer murdered on a highway exit, threats sent to the police chief, an officer within the department interfering with a missing persons investigation, a grandmother refusing to testify, a gun sold under a false name. The machinery of justice in Nelson County was not just failing, it looked, from certain angles, like it was being deliberately sabotaged from inside. Crystal's mother, Sherry Ballard, believed her daughter had heard or learned something she shouldn't have, possibly related to the murder of Officer Jason Ellis. Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, went further. He became, in his wife's words, the investigator. He created a group called Team Crystal, a network of community members dedicated to finding his daughter. He knocked on doors. He pressured officials. He refused to let the case die. 16 months after Crystal disappeared, Tommy Ballard was killed. On the morning of November 19, 2016, Tommy was preparing for a hunting trip on his family's property, land located near the Bluegrass Parkway. He was with his 12-year-old grandson, Crystal's eldest son. At approximately 7:54 a.m., an unknown shooter fired a single shot. The bullet struck Tommy in the chest. He died instantly. His grandson was right there, a 12-year-old boy standing on his family's land, watching his grandfather collapse. Police cleared the boy immediately. Tommy's own gun had never been fired, ruling out any possibility of a self-inflicted wound or accident. The FBI classified Tommy Ballard's death as a homicide, but no arrest was made. No suspect was publicly identified. Sherry Ballard told reporters, "I knew in my heart it was no accident." Consider what the Ballard family had endured by the end of 2016. Their daughter had vanished. Her body had never been found. Her boyfriend was the prime suspect, but had not been charged. And now, their patriarch, the man who had spent 16 months refusing to stop looking for Crystal, had been shot dead on his own property, in front of his own grandchild. And then consider the geography. Jason Ellis was killed at exit 34 of the Bluegrass Parkway. Crystal Rogers' car was found along the same highway. Tommy Ballard was killed on family land adjacent to that parkway. The road kept appearing. The road connected things. Years passed. The cases sat open, festering, unanswered. Bardstown became known nationally, not for its bourbon or its beauty, but for its body count. Podcasts covered the cases. Documentaries were produced. The FBI conducted 2 major searches in Bardstown, one in August 2020, another in August 2021. During the second search, agents focused on a subdivision called Woodlawn Springs, where Brooks Houck's construction company had built several houses shortly after Crystal's disappearance. On August 27, 2021, the FBI announced that an item of interest had been recovered from the concrete at one of the homes. They did not say what it was. The FBI also issued a statement that day, directed at the town itself. "We know there are people in Bardstown who have information on this case. It is time for those people to come forward." Then, in September 2023, the case finally broke. A Nelson County grand jury indicted a local man named Joseph Lawson, 32, on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and complicity in tampering with physical evidence. Days later, on September 27th, Brooks Houck was arrested and charged with murder. At his arraignment, the prosecutor asked for a $10 million bond and revealed something that connected one more thread. Investigators had recovered a gun that had been sold by Nick Houck under an assumed name. According to prosecutors, that weapon could be a match for the gun used to kill Tommy Ballard. In December 2023, Joseph's father, Steve Lawson, was also arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The trials came in 2025. In May, Steve Lawson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison. In July, Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson stood trial together. After a 10-day trial, the jury found both guilty on all counts. Houck was convicted of murder and tampering with physical evidence. Joseph Lawson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. On September 17, 2025, Brooks Houck was sentenced to life in prison. Joseph Lawson received 25 years. At sentencing, Crystal's mother, Sherry Ballard, addressed the court. The woman who had spent a decade searching for her daughter and had lost her husband to a bullet on their own land, finally had a conviction. Houck filed an appeal in January 2026. As of this recording, that appeal is pending. He is currently incarcerated at the Roederer Assessment Center in Oldham County, Kentucky. But the conviction of Brooks Houck answered only one of the 4 cases that haunt Bardstown. Crystal Rogers' body has never been found. Tommy Ballard's murder remains officially unsolved, though the revelation about the gun sold by Nick Houck under a false name hangs heavy over the case. That gun is one of the most troubling loose ends in the entire Bardstown saga. At Brooks Houck's arraignment in October 2023, Prosecutor Shane Young revealed that investigators had recovered a firearm that had been sold by Nick Houck, the fired Bardstown police officer, Brooks's brother, under an assumed name. Prosecutors stated that this weapon could be a ballistic match for the gun used to kill Tommy Ballard. If that connection is confirmed, it would mean that the brother of Crystal Rogers' killer, a man who was once a sworn law enforcement officer in the very town where these murders occurred, provided the weapon used to assassinate the father of the woman his brother allegedly murdered. The layers of that are staggering. A family that didn't just kill one person and cover it up, but allegedly reached out and silenced the person who was getting closest to exposing them, and did so using a gun funneled through a disgraced cop. Tommy Ballard's murder remains officially unsolved. No one has been charged. But the walls are closing. The conviction of Brooks Houck, the sentences handed to the Lawsons, the gun, the FBI's continued classification of Tommy's death as an active homicide. Sherry Ballard has never stopped pushing. She has stood in front of cameras for a decade, through the disappearance of her daughter, the murder of her husband, the years of silence, the arrests, the trials, and the conviction. After Brooks Houck was sentenced to life in September 2025, she told reporters, "He underestimated the love me and my husband had for our daughter and what we would do to find her." Tommy Ballard died because he refused to stop looking. That much seems clear. The man who spent 16 months knocking on doors, pressuring officials, and building a search network called Team Crystal a 54-year-old father who became his own detective because the system wouldn't do it fast enough, was shot once in the chest on his own land in front of his 12-year-old grandson by a person who has never been identified in court. The grandson was Crystal's eldest child. He watched his grandfather die on a November morning on property next to the Bluegrass Parkway, the same stretch of road where his mother's car had been found, the same highway where Officer Ellis had been killed. That child has now lost his mother, his grandfather, and any sense that the world he lives in is fair or safe. The murders of Jason Ellis and of Kathy and Samantha Netherland remain completely open. No suspects, no arrests, no public explanation. And the Bluegrass Parkway still runs through the center of all of it. The road where a police officer was ambushed, where a missing woman's car was found, and alongside which a father was shot dead for the crime of looking too hard for his daughter. Bardstown, Kentucky, population 14,000. Bourbon distilleries on every corner. Voted the most beautiful small town in America. And between 2013 and 2016, 5 people were killed or vanished from this place. 1 case has been resolved, 3 remain open. And the question that no one in Bardstown has been able to answer, the question that sits at the center of all 4 cases like a stone at the bottom of a well, is whether these were 4 separate tragedies that happened to strike the same small town, or whether they are pieces of the same story, connected by the same road, the same people, and the same silence. If this case stays with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Bardstown is not finished. 1 man is in prison, 3 cases remain open, and somewhere in that town of 14,000 people, someone knows something they haven't said yet.